The morning of the 12th of October, 1944, dawned cold and grey over the airfield at Debden, England. Ground crews moved through the pre-dawn darkness, their breath visible in the frigid air as they prepared the silver fighters of the 357th Fighter Group for another mission into the heart of Nazi Germany. Among the rows of North American P-51 Mustangs, one particular aircraft stood out with its distinctive markings and the name painted on its fuselage. This was the mount of a young captain who would, in the months to come, achieve something that seemed impossible even by the standards of aerial combat in the Second World War. Captain William Jensen was 23 years old, though his eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen far more than his years should have allowed. He had grown up on a farm in Nebraska, where the endless skies had called to him since childhood. He had learned to fly in a beaten-up Piper Cub at the age of 16, paying for lessons by working double shifts at his father's grain elevator. When the war came, he had been among the first to volunteer, driven by a combination of patriotic duty and an almost spiritual need to be among the clouds. The P-51D Mustang he flew was a marvel of engineering, the culmination of American and British collaboration that had produced perhaps the finest fighter aircraft of the entire war. Powered by the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin V16507 engine, the Mustang could generate 1,490 horsepower at war emergency power. This tremendous power plant drove a four-bladed Hamilton Standard propeller with a diameter of 11 feet 2 inches, allowing the aircraft to reach speeds exceeding 440 miles per hour at optimal altitude. With a wingspan of 37 feet and a length of 32 feet 3 inches, the Mustang was sleek and deadly, every line of its aluminum skin designed for speed and agility. What truly set the P-51D apart from its predecessors and competitors was its range. Internal fuel tanks held 184 gallons, and with two 110-gallon drop tanks mounted under the wings, the Mustang could fly deep into Germany, escort the heavy bombers all the way to their targets, engage in combat, and still return home. This capability had revolutionized the air war over Europe, finally giving the daylight bombing campaign the protection it desperately needed. The aircraft's armament consisted of 6 Browning M2 50-caliber machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing, with a total ammunition capacity of 1,880 rounds. These weapons could fire at a combined rate of approximately 4,200 rounds per minute, delivering devastating firepower at ranges up to 1,000 yards, though most kills occurred at distances of 300 yards or less. Jensen had named his Mustang Prairie Fire after the wildfires that would sometimes sweep across the grasslands of his home state. The nose bore the standard olive-drab anti-glare panel, though the rest of the aircraft gleamed in natural metal finish. 22 small swastikas were painted below the canopy, each one representing a confirmed aerial victory. This number was extraordinary by any measure, placing Jensen among the elite aces of the European theatre. But what made Jensen's achievement truly remarkable was not simply the number of kills, but the circumstances under which many of them had occurred. Unlike most aces who accumulated their victories over dozens of missions in standard engagements, Jensen had a particular talent for finding himself alone against overwhelming odds and somehow emerging victorious. It was a pattern that had begun early in his combat career and had only intensified as the war progressed. The first time it happened was over France in April of 1944, 2 months before the D-Day invasion. Jensen had been part of a bomber escort mission, flying one of 50 P-51 seconds assigned to protect a formation of B-17 flying fortresses attacking marshalling yards near Paris. The mission had been proceeding routinely when Jensen's engine began running rough at 28,000 feet. Oil pressure was fluctuating, and he could see a thin stream of grey smoke trailing from the cowling. He had radioed his flight leader, received permission to abort, and began a gradual descent toward home, nursing the ailing engine and hoping it would hold together long enough to get him across the channel. He was passing through 15,000 feet, alone and vulnerable, when he spotted them below, a formation of 12 Focke-Wulf FW 190 seconds climbing hard from the south, clearly vectoring toward the bomber stream he had just left. Every tactical doctrine, every bit of training, every survival instinct told Jensen to avoid engagement. He was alone, his engine was damaged, and he was outnumbered 12-1. The sensible action was to continue his withdrawal, perhaps radioing a warning to the bomber escort, while putting as much distance as possible between himself and the German fighters. Instead, Jensen pushed the throttle forward and dove. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 was one of the Luftwaffe's premier fighters, a radial-engined brute that could absorb tremendous punishment and deliver devastating firepower. The variant Jensen faced that day, the WW-190A8, was powered by a BMW 801D2 14-cylinder radial engine, producing 1,700 horsepower. It was armed with two 13mm MG 131 machine guns and four 20mm MG 151 cannons, making it one of the most heavily armed fighters in the sky. The FW-190 excelled at high-speed diving attacks and could outroll almost any Allied fighter. It was a formidable opponent in the hands of an experienced pilot. Jensen's Mustang screamed down from above, accelerating rapidly. He had the advantage of altitude and surprise, two critical factors in aerial combat. The Germans were climbing in a standard formation, likely unaware of the solitary American fighter plunging toward them from the Sunday. Jensen selected the rearmost aircraft in the formation, a FW-190 trailing slightly behind and to the right of his wingman. He opened fire at 400 yards, a longer range than he preferred, but he wanted to create chaos in the formation before they could react. The 50 caliber guns hammered, sending streams of tracers arcing through the sky. His first burst missed, passing just behind the target as the fair W-190 continued its climb. Jensen adjusted, leading the target more, and fired again. This time the rounds found their mark. Strikes sparkled along the FW-190's wing root and fuselage. Pieces of cowling tore away, and suddenly the German fighter was trailing thick black smoke. It rolled inverted and fell away, spiraling toward the earth below. The formation exploded into chaos. German pilots scattered, breaking in all directions as they searched for their attacker. Jensen continued through the formation, his speed carrying him past the confused enemy fighters. He pulled hard on the stick, trading speed for altitude in a climbing zoom that took him back up to 18,000 feet. His engine was still running rough, the damaged cylinder clanking ominously, but it was holding together. Below him, the FW-190 were reforming, but they were now on the defensive, their mission to intercept the bombers forgotten as they sought to deal with this aggressive American. Jensen could see their leader organizing them, pulling the scattered fighters back into combat formation. They began climbing again, this time directly toward him. What happened next defied conventional tactical wisdom. Rather than using his altitude advantage to extend away from the enemy and escape, Jensen met their climb with another diving attack. He selected two fighters flying in close formation, likely a leader and his wingman, and opened fire at 350 yards. The geometry of the attack was perfect. Both aircraft flew directly into his stream of fire. The leader took hits along his canopy and engine, and Jensen saw the pilot slump in his seat. The FW-190 nosed over into a steep dive that would end only one way. The wingman, perhaps distracted by his leader's death, presented a perfect broadside profile. Jensen's bullets tore through the cockpit and fuel tanks. The W-190 exploded in a brilliant orange fireball that momentarily illuminated the sky. Now the Germans understood what they faced. This was no panicked pilot fleeing for home, but an aggressive, skilled adversary who was willing to engage despite impossible odds. Several of the W-190 abandoned the formation entirely, diving away to seek easier prey or simply to escape this encounter. But 6 remained, and they were determined to exact revenge. The swirling dogfight that followed ranged across 20 miles of French countryside and descended from 18,000 feet to barely 1,000. Jensen flew with a combination of precise calculation and pure instinct. He understood the Mustang's strengths and the FW-190's weaknesses, and he exploited them ruthlessly. When the Germans tried to engage him in turning fights, he would extend away using the Mustang's superior speed, then reverse and attack from an unexpected angle. When they attempted diving attacks, he would pull into tight climbing spirals that the heavier P-192 could not match. His damaged engine limited his options, forcing him to avoid full power settings that might cause it to fail completely. This constraint actually worked in his favor, making his maneuvers less predictable because he was operating at power settings the German pilots would not expect. They assumed he would use full throttle to escape, and their tactical decisions were based on that assumption. Instead, Jensen fought at reduced power, using superior positioning and marksmanship rather than raw performance. One by one, he picked them off. A high-side attack on a P-190, attempting to climb back to altitude, sent it down with its cooling system destroyed, glycol streaming from shattered pipes. A head-on pass, one of the most dangerous maneuvers in aerial combat, resulted in a collision of gunfire where Jensen's 6 .50 caliber weapons proved superior to his opponent's armament. The P-190 staggered through the sky, its engine torn apart, before the pilot bailed out. A snapshot at a crossing target caught a German pilot who had made the fatal error of flying straight and level for just 3 seconds too long. The P-190 fell away with half its tail section shot off. The remaining 3 German pilots had finally had enough. They dove away to the east, using the P-190's excellent diving speed to escape. Jensen considered pursuing but checked himself. His engine was barely running now, the oil pressure almost at zero. He had expended most of his ammunition. He was deep inside enemy territory, alone, in a damaged aircraft. He had already pushed his luck far beyond any reasonable limit. He turned for home, nursing the dying engine westward. Twice, it nearly quit completely, the propeller windmilling as the cylinders struggled to fire. But the Packard Merlin was a robust engine, and it kept running through sheer mechanical determination. Jensen crossed the French coast at 3,000 feet, far too low for comfort, and made it halfway across the channel before the engine finally seized with a tortured metallic scream. The propeller stopped, frozen in place, transforming from a source of thrust into nothing more than a brake. The Mustang became a glider, one with a relatively poor glide ratio. Jensen was still 20 miles from the English coast. He radioed his position, knowing that air-sea rescue would be looking for him, then focused on stretching his glide as far as possible. He made it to within 3 miles of shore before running out of altitude. The ditching in the cold channel waters was violent but survivable. The Mustang's fuselage cracked just behind the cockpit, and the aircraft began sinking immediately. Jensen had already jettisoned his canopy and released his harness. He climbed out onto the wing, inflated his life vest, and swam clear just before the aircraft slipped beneath the waves. A rescue launch from the Royal Air Force picked him up 45 minutes later, shivering and exhausted but alive. When he was debriefed back at Debden, the intelligence officers were skeptical of his claims. One pilot, alone, with a damaged aircraft, claiming 6 FTW-190 destroyed, it seemed impossible, but gun camera film told the story, showing clear destruction of 3 aircraft. Radio intercepts of German communications confirmed heavy losses in that sector at that time. Wreckage found on the ground provided additional confirmation. The kills were verified, and Jensen's score jumped from 2 to 8 in a single mission. It should have been an anomaly, a singular occurrence born of unique circumstances and extraordinary luck. Instead, it proved to be a pattern. 3 weeks later, Jensen was flying top cover for another bomber mission, this time targeting oil refineries in central Germany. The mission had attracted fierce Luftwaffe resistance, with multiple groups of fighters attempting to penetrate the escort screen. In the swirling chaos of a major air battle involving hundreds of aircraft, Jensen became separated from his flight while pursuing a Messerschmitt Bf 109 that he successfully shot down. Finding himself alone at 30,000 feet, he was about to rejoin the main formation when he observed something that changed his calculus entirely. Below him, at 22,000 feet, a crippled B-17 was struggling to maintain altitude. The bomber had clearly taken severe damage, with one engine shut down and trailing smoke, and large portions of its tail section shot away. It was falling behind the main formation, the classic scenario that made it easy prey for German fighters. Even as Jensen watched, he saw them approaching, 8 Bf-109Gs, the most common variant of Germany's most famous fighter. The Messerschmitt Bf-109G6, known as the Gustav, was powered by the Daimler-Benz DB 605 amperes liquid-cooled V12 engine producing 1,475 horsepower. It could reach speeds of 386 miles per hour at altitude and was armed with 130mm Mk108 cannon firing through the propeller hub and two 13mm MG131 machine guns above the engine. Some variants carried additional 20mm cannons in underwing pods. The 109 was highly maneuverable, especially at high altitudes, and in the hands of a skilled pilot was one of the most dangerous fighters in the sky. The 8 Messerschmitts were setting up for a classic stern attack on the damaged bomber, positioning themselves to come in from behind and below where most of the B-17's defensive guns had limited traverse. The bomber's crew had to know they were coming, but there was little they could do. They couldn't outrun their pursuers, couldn't outmaneuver them, and their defensive fire would be largely ineffective until the attackers were already in their firing positions. Jensen dove. He came down on the Messerschmitts like a hawk on field mice, trading all his altitude for devastating speed. The P-51 exceeded 500 miles per hour in the dive, the airframe shaking as it approached its structural limits. Jensen picked the leftmost fighter in the German formation and opened fire at extreme range, more than 600 yards out. He wasn't expecting to hit at that distance, but he wanted to disrupt the attack and announce his presence. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The German formation broke apart as pilots reacted to the unexpected threat. Jensen's bullets actually connected with his target despite the extreme range, sending the Bf-109 into a violent roll from which it never recovered. It was a lucky shot, the kind that occurred perhaps once in 1,000 attempts, but in combat, luck counted just as much as skill. Jensen pulled out of his dive at high speed, extending past the scattered German fighters. He could see the damaged B-17 inches the distance, still struggling westward, its crew no doubt watching the drama unfolding around them with a mixture of hope and terror. The 7 remaining Messerschmitts had abandoned their attack on the bomber and were now focused entirely on Jensen. What followed was an extended running battle that lasted nearly 30 minutes and covered over 100 miles of German territory. The fight moved gradually westward as Jensen used the Mustang's superior speed to control the engagement, never allowing the Germans to pin him down or concentrate their attacks. He would engage, fire a burst, then extend away before they could bring their numbers to bear. Then he would reverse, come back at them from a different angle, and repeat the process. The Bf-109 pilots were skilled and determined. They worked in pairs, attempting to trap Jensen between them, but he refused to cooperate. He flew with his head constantly moving, scanning the sky in all directions, never fixating on a single target long enough to become vulnerable to another. When 2 Messerschmitts tried to sandwich him, he went vertical, the Mustang's powerful engine pulling it straight up in a climb that the Bf-109 seconds, already at high altitude, could not match. When they attempted to dive away and reset the engagement, he dove with them, his aircraft's superior high-speed handling allowing him to close the distance and get into firing position. One Bf-109 made the mistake of trying to outturn the Mustang at medium altitude. It was a common misconception that the 109 could outturn the P-51, a belief based on the German fighter's excellent high-altitude maneuverability. But at 15,000 feet, the Mustang's laminar flow wing gave it superior turning performance. Jensen stayed with the Messerschmitt through turn after turn, gradually closing the distance until he was in perfect firing position. A 2-second burst sent the Bf-109 down in flames. Another German pilot attempted a head-on attack, the same maneuver Jensen had used successfully in his previous engagement, but head-on passes were deadly to both parties, a mutual test of nerves where the first pilot to break off was at a disadvantage. Jensen held his course, firing in short, controlled bursts. The Messerschmitt fired back, its 30mm cannon shells passing close enough that Jensen could see them. At the last moment, both pilots broke, rolling in opposite directions to avoid collision. But Jensen had scored hits. As he looked back, he saw the Bf-109 streaming coolant, its engine overheating. It would never make it home. The fight gradually wore down the German formation. Ammunition expenditure, fuel consumption, and the stress of combat against a clearly superior pilot took their toll. One by one, the Bf-109 seconds broke off and headed for home. Jensen let them go, conserving his remaining ammunition and fuel for the long flight back to England. He climbed back up to find the damaged B-17, which was still struggling westward, and took up position as its escort. The bomber crew, who had watched the entire dogfight, waggled their wings in gratitude. Jensen escorted them all the way to the Channel, before turning for his own base. The debriefing again brought skepticism until the bomber crew confirmed his claims. The B-17's ball turret gunner had actually filmed part of the engagement with a handheld camera, providing irrefutable evidence of at least 3 kills. Jensen's gun camera showed 2 more. German radio intercepts confirmed the loss of 5 Bf-109 seconds in that sector. Jensen's score now stood at 15 confirmed victories. The intelligence officers began to notice a pattern in Jensen's combat reports. He seemed to possess an unusual ability to make rapid tactical decisions under extreme pressure, to calculate angles and trajectories almost instantaneously, and to remain calm when facing overwhelming odds. A flight surgeon interviewed him, looking for some explanation for these abilities. What he found was a young man with exceptional spatial reasoning skills, likely enhanced by his childhood experience flying, combined with a temperament that became calmer rather than more agitated under stress. But there was something else, something Jensen tried to explain but found difficult to articulate. When he was in combat, the world seemed to slow down. He could see trajectories unfolding, predict where aircraft would be seconds before they arrived, sense the intentions of enemy pilots from the smallest movements of their aircraft. It was not supernatural, not some mystical ability, but rather the product of complete immersion in the environment of aerial combat. His conscious mind would recede, and some deeper, instinctive part of his brain would take over, processing information and making decisions faster than rational thought would allow. Modern researchers might recognize this as a flow state, the psychological condition where an individual becomes fully absorbed in an activity, performing at their absolute peak. Athletes describe it as being in the zone. For Jensen, it happened most often when he was alone against multiple opponents, when the stakes were highest and the margin for error smallest. His reputation began to spread through the fighter groups in England. Pilots would ask to fly on his wing, hoping to learn from his technique. But Jensen was a difficult teacher because much of what he did was intuitive rather than analytical. He could describe the mechanics of a maneuver, the throttle settings and stick positions, but he couldn't fully explain the decision-making process that led him to execute that particular maneuver at that particular moment. In August of 1944, with the Allied armies breaking out of Normandy and sweeping across France, the Luftwaffe was being pushed back but was far from defeated. German fighter production actually peaked in 1944, and despite heavy losses, the Luftwaffe could still put hundreds of fighters into the air when defending critical targets. The 357th Fighter Group was flying multiple missions each day, sometimes escorting bombers, sometimes flying fighter sweeps seeking out German aircraft, sometimes supporting ground forces. It was during a fighter sweep over eastern France that Jensen had his most extraordinary engagement. The mission called for 4 flights of 4 aircraft each to sweep an area where intelligence suggested a concentration of German fighters was being assembled. The plan was to engage any enemy aircraft encountered and disrupt German operations in the sector. Jensen was leading a flight of 4 Mustangs at 25,000 feet when his radio failed. It simply went dead in the middle of a transmission, likely due to a faulty connection that had been stressed by the constant vibration of flight. He immediately became separated from the rest of his flight, who were maneuvering in response to radio calls he could no longer hear. Within minutes, he was alone in the sky, unable to communicate and unsure of his flight's location. Standard procedure would have been to return to base immediately. A fighter without radio was a liability to any formation, unable to coordinate with other aircraft or respond to warnings. But Jensen was over enemy territory, and he knew the rest of his group was somewhere nearby, possibly engaged in combat. He decided to continue the sweep alone, climbing to 30,000 feet where he could observe a large area. He found what he was looking for 10 minutes later. Below him, at 20,000 feet, was a formation unlike anything he had seen before. Approximately 30 German aircraft were flying in a loose gaggle formation, a mixture of Bf 109 seconds and FW 190 seconds. This was a Gefechtsverband, a combat formation the Luftwaffe had developed to counter Allied fighter tactics. The large number of aircraft provided mutual support, and the loose formation allowed for greater flexibility than the rigid Vic formations of earlier in the war. Jensen should have marked their position, returned to base, and reported the sighting. 30 against 1 were impossible odds by any rational assessment. But as he watched the German formation, he noticed something important. They were flying straight and level, maintaining a steady course toward the west. They clearly hadn't spotted him, as they showed no signs of increased alertness or defensive maneuvering. He had complete surprise and a significant altitude advantage. He decided to attack. His approach was calculated and methodical. He positioned himself up-sun from the German formation, using the glare to mask his presence. Then he dove, building speed carefully to avoid creating a visible contrail that might alert the enemy. He selected the rearmost element of the formation, a pair of faux faux 190 seconds flying slightly separated from the main group. The attack was executed with surgical precision. Jensen opened fire at 300 yards on the trailing faux 190, walked his tracers into the target, and saw pieces fly off the German fighter before it rolled over and fell away. He immediately shifted to the second FW 190, which was just beginning to react. Another burst, another kill. Then he was through the formation, using his diving speed to extend away before the Germans could respond. The formation exploded into chaos, 30 German fighters scattered in all directions, pilots searching frantically for the attacker. Jensen pulled up into a climbing zoom, trading his excess speed for altitude, returning to his perch above the confused enemy. What followed was one of the most remarkable displays of aerial combat in the history of air warfare. For the next 40 minutes, Jensen conducted a systematic campaign of hit-and-run attacks against the German formation. He would dive, strike, and extend away before the enemy could concentrate against him. Then he would climb back to altitude, reposition, and attack again from a different angle. The Germans tried multiple times to organize a coordinated response, but Jensen's attacks kept disrupting their formations. Every time a leader would begin organizing fighters for a counterattack, Jensen would target that leader, forcing him to maneuver defensively. The psychological impact of a lone attacker repeatedly striking with impunity unnerved many of the German pilots, some of whom were relatively inexperienced replacements thrown into combat with minimal training. Jensen used every tactical advantage available to him. He attacked from the sun, making himself difficult to spot. He used cloud formations for concealment, diving out of clouds to strike before climbing back into cover. He varied his attack patterns, sometimes diving steeply, sometimes making shallow slashing attacks, sometimes zooming up from below. The unpredictability made it nearly impossible for the Germans to set a trap. His ammunition management was masterful. With 1,880 rounds total for his 6 guns, he had approximately 18 seconds of firing time if he held the trigger down continuously. Instead, he fired in short, precise bursts of 1 to 2 seconds, making every bullet count. He aimed for critical components, engines, fuel tanks, cockpits. When he scored hits, they were usually fatal. One after another, German fighters fell. Some spun down trailing fire and smoke, others broke apart in the air when their fuel tanks exploded. A few pilots bailed out, their parachutes blossoming white against the ground below. The sky filled with the debris of combat, shell casings, pieces of aircraft, long trails of smoke marking the paths of dying aircraft. The German formation, which had started at 30 aircraft, began to dissolve. Some pilots, their nerves broken by the relentless attacks, simply dove away and fled. Others broke into smaller groups, trying to provide mutual support, but these groups became easier targets for Jensen's attacks. The Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine depended on numerical superiority and coordinated attacks. Against a single opponent who refused to engage on their terms, that doctrine failed. 25 minutes into the engagement, Jensen had shot down 7 aircraft and damaged several others. His ammunition was running low, perhaps 3 seconds of firing time remaining. His fuel was also becoming a concern, as the constant maneuvering and periods of high power consumption ate through his reserves. But he could see the German formation was on the verge of complete collapse. He dove for one more attack. A Bf-109 was attempting to rally several other fighters, the pilot no doubt an experienced leader trying to restore order. Jensen came in from the side, a deflection shot that required leading the target by several aircraft lengths. He pressed the trigger and felt the Mustang shudder as the guns fired. Tracers arced through the sky and converged on the Messerschmitt. The 109's canopy shattered, and the aircraft pitched forward into a vertical dive. That was the final straw. The remaining German fighters abandoned all pretense of formation and scattered in every direction. The sky, which minutes before had been filled with aircraft, was suddenly empty except for Jensen and the smoking trails of falling fighters. Jensen turned for home, his ammunition exhausted and his fuel low. Behind him, he could see parachutes dotting the sky, perhaps 8 or 9 of them, German pilots who had successfully bailed out. Others had likely gone down with their aircraft, either killed in combat or unable to escape their damaged planes. The flight back to England was tense. Jensen's fuel situation was critical, and he had to carefully balance airspeed and altitude to maximize his range. He descended gradually, trading altitude for distance, constantly calculating whether he would make it home. The Channel crossing was particularly anxious, as he had no altitude to spare if his engine failed. But the reliable Merlin kept running, and he crossed the English coast at 2,000 feet. He made it back to Debden with less than 10 gallons of fuel remaining, barely enough for 2 more minutes of flight. As he climbed out of his cockpit, his crew chief noticed the empty ammunition boxes and the smell of burnt gunpowder permeating the aircraft. The gun barrels were almost too hot to touch, testament to the extended engagement. The debriefing proved difficult because Jensen had no wingman to confirm his claims, and his radio had been inoperative. But his gun camera film was dramatic and conclusive. It showed clear destruction of 8 aircraft, not the 7 he had claimed in his initial report. Intelligence officers examined the film frame by frame and identified one additional kill that Jensen himself had not been certain of. The German aircraft had been damaged by his fire and then collided with another 190 while maneuvering, sending both aircraft down. Whether this should be counted as 1 kill or 2 was debated, but ultimately both were credited to Jensen. His score now stood at 25 confirmed victories, making him one of the highest-scoring American aces in the European theatre. But more significantly, 23 of those kills had occurred in just 3 engagements, where he had fought alone against overwhelming numbers. The Army Air Forces recognized both the propaganda value and the military significance of Jensen's achievements. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for the engagement against the 30 German fighters, with the citation specifically noting his extraordinary heroism and disregard for his own safety in engaging a vastly superior enemy force. He was promoted to major and offered a position as an instructor, training new fighter pilots in the tactics he had developed. Jensen declined. He had not come to Europe to teach or to be paraded before the press. He had come to fight, and while the war continued, that was what he intended to do. The 357th Fighter Group's commander, understanding that Jensen was most effective when allowed to operate according to his own instincts, gave him unusual latitude. He was assigned to lead a flight, but with the understanding that if situations developed where he needed to separate from the formation, he was authorized to do so. The fall of 1944 saw the air war over Germany intensify. The Luftwaffe, despite mounting losses, continued to resist fiercely. German fighters were increasingly concentrated around critical industrial targets, particularly the oil refineries that supplied fuel for the Wehrmacht's vehicles and aircraft. The Allied strategic bombing campaign focused heavily on these targets, knowing that without fuel, Germany's war machine would grind to a halt. In November, Jensen participated in a major raid against the synthetic oil plants at Leuna, near Leipzig. The raid involved more than 1,000 heavy bombers, escorted by over 500 fighters. The Luftwaffe response was massive, with an estimated 300 German fighters scrambled to defend the target. The resulting air battle was one of the largest of the war, with aircraft swirling in combat across hundreds of square miles of sky. In the chaos of the massive engagement, Jensen's flight became separated while pursuing a group of German fighters that were attempting to attack the bomber stream. In the swirling melee, Jensen found himself alone once again, this time at 15,000 feet over heavily defended enemy territory. He was low on fuel, having already been engaged in combat for over an hour, and his ammunition was down to about 30%. The sensible decision was to withdraw, to head for home while he still had sufficient fuel. But then he saw them, a flight of 4 Bf-109 seconds that had apparently also become separated from the main battle. The German fighters were climbing toward a damaged B-17 that was struggling to maintain altitude, one of its engines shut down and trailing smoke. Jensen had already saved one bomber earlier in his combat career. The pull to do so again was irresistible. He dove toward the Messerschmitts, even though his fuel situation meant he was gambling his own survival on this engagement. The 4 Bf-109 pilots were experienced. They spotted Jensen's approach and immediately split into two elements, attempting to engage him while still maintaining pressure on the bomber. It was a sound tactical decision that should have forced Jensen to choose between pursuing one element and being attacked by the other. Instead, Jensen did something unexpected. He flew directly toward the bomber, positioning himself between the B-17 and the German fighters. Then he began flying in a weaving pattern, forcing the Bf-109 seconds to approach through his field of fire if they wanted to attack the bomber. He had essentially turned himself into an extension of the bomber's defensive armament. The German pilots were faced with a dilemma. They could attempt to engage Jensen directly, but doing so would mean exposing themselves to his guns in a straightforward fight where his skill advantage would be decisive. Or they could try to bypass him and attack the bomber, but that would require flying through his fire envelope. They chose to engage him directly, no doubt believing that 4 against 1 would prevail regardless of the American pilot's skill. The dogfight took place in a relatively confined area, with the damaged bomber slowly circling below as its crew watched the drama unfold. Jensen fought with absolute precision, using every ounce of the Mustang's performance capability. When the Germans tried to use their numerical advantage to trap him in a crossfire, he went vertical, climbing straight up until his aircraft hung on the propeller, then falling off into a spin that he controlled perfectly, emerging at a different altitude and position. One Bf-109 attempted a high-speed diving attack and found itself unable to pull out in time, the pilot either hit by Jensen's fire or simply losing control at high speed. The Messerschmitt augured into the ground in a spectacular explosion. Another 109 made the fatal error of crossing in front of Jensen at close range, offering a perfect deflection shot. Jensen's remaining ammunition was barely sufficient, but he made it count. The Bf-109 staggered through the sky with half its wing shot away, then spun into the ground. The remaining 2 German pilots, now facing an opponent who had just shot down 2 of their comrades, lost their nerve. They dove away to the east, abandoning the attack on the bomber. Jensen let them go, his ammunition almost completely exhausted and his fuel situation now critical. He pulled alongside the B-17, whose crew gave him enthusiastic waves of gratitude. He could see the damage to the bomber was severe. One engine out, large holes in the fuselage, and what looked like damage to the hydraulic systems. The bomber wouldn't make it back to England without assistance. Jensen elected to escort it, even though doing so meant crossing the entirety of Germany and the occupied territories at low altitude in a fuel-critical situation, with no ammunition remaining. The slow flight back was agonizing. The bomber could barely maintain 140 miles per hour, and Jensen had to weave above and around it to avoid stalling. His fuel gauge showed the needle dropping toward empty. He calculated distances, airspeeds, fuel consumption rates, and realized he wasn't going to make it back to England. He would run out of fuel somewhere over Belgium or northern France, both of which were by this point liberated by Allied forces, but finding a suitable airfield while gliding a dead-stick Mustang would be challenging. The bomber made it to Allied-held territory and landed at an emergency airfield in Belgium, its crew no doubt grateful to be alive. Jensen escorted it all the way down, then climbed back to altitude to maximize his gliding distance when his engine inevitably quit. It did so 15 minutes later, the Merlin coughing twice and then falling silent as the last drops of fuel were consumed. Jensen glided the Mustang to a small grass airfield that turned out to be a forward base for the 9th Air Force's fighter bombers. His landing without power was smooth and professional, the product of his early training in the underpowered Piper Cub, where power-off landings were routine. The ground crews at the field were astonished to see a P-51 from the 8th Air Force land without its engine running. Jensen was returned to his base 2 days later, after his Mustang was refueled and the engine checked for damage. The bomber crew he had escorted tracked him down to thank him personally, and their account of the engagement led to confirmation of the 2 additional kills. His score now stood at 27, all achieved in less than 7 months of combat. By December 1944, Jensen had become something of a legend in the fighter groups stationed in England. Stories of his solo engagements were told in ready rooms across a dozen airfields, often embellished with details that made the true events seem tame by comparison. Some pilots viewed him as an inspiration, proof that skill and aggression could overcome numerical odds. Others saw him as reckless, a pilot whose luck would inevitably run out. Jensen paid little attention to either view. He continued to fly missions, continued to engage the enemy with the same calculated aggression that had characterized all his combat. But the nature of the air war was changing. The Luftwaffe was running short of fuel, and pilot quality was declining as experienced aviators were killed faster than they could be replaced. Large-scale air battles became less frequent as German fighters were increasingly hoarded to defend against specific raids. On the 23rd of December 1944, Jensen flew what would be his final combat mission. The weather had cleared after days of overcast skies that had grounded both sides during the opening phase of Germany's Ardennes offensive. The 357th Fighter Group was tasked with providing air support to ground forces battling German armoured columns in the Bulge. The mission involved strafing and bombing attacks on German columns, dangerous work that brought fighters down into the range of intensive anti-aircraft fire. Jensen led a flight of 4 Mustangs that had been modified to carry bombs, making them less effective as air superiority fighters but more useful for ground attack. After dropping their bombs on a concentration of German vehicles, Jensen's flight climbed back to altitude and began the flight back to base. They were at 12,000 feet, passing over the Belgian town of Bastogne, which was surrounded by German forces, when Jensen spotted enemy aircraft, 5 Bf-109 seconds at 10,000 feet, circling above the besieged American forces, no doubt preparing to strafe the defenders. Jensen immediately dove to engage, his flight following. The attack should have been straightforward, 4 American fighters diving on 5 Germans with the advantage of altitude and surprise. But as they closed, Jensen's keen eyesight picked out additional aircraft that had been hidden by the lower flight. Another 10 Bf-109 seconds at 15,000 feet, positioned to counter exactly the kind of attack Jensen was making. It was a classic trap. The lower flight was bait, and Jensen had taken it. He radioed a warning to his flight, ordering them to break off and climb. But it was too late. The Germans above were already diving, perfectly positioned to intercept. What saved Jensen and his flight was the same aggressive instinct that had characterized all his combat. Instead of trying to run from the trap, he flew directly into it, ordering his flight to punch through the lower group of Messerschmitts and then reverse to engage the upper group from below. It was a dangerous maneuver that violated standard tactical doctrine, but it had the advantage of surprise. The Germans expected the American fighters to either withdraw or engage in a defensive fight while trying to regain altitude. They didn't expect the Mustangs to accelerate through the lower group and then zoom climb to meet the diving upper group head-on. The collision of aircraft occurred at a closing speed exceeding 800 miles per hour, with both groups opening fire almost simultaneously. Jensen's 6.50 caliber guns hammered, sending streams of tracers into the diving Messerschmitts. He saw strikes on at least 2 aircraft before he had to brake hard right to avoid a collision. His wingman called out a kill, and Jensen glimpsed a Bf-109 falling away with its engine destroyed. The furball that developed involved 15 aircraft whirling in a space of perhaps 2 cubic miles of sky, all at altitudes between 8 and 15,000 feet. Jensen found himself engaged with 3 Bf-109 seconds simultaneously, a situation that even his considerable skill struggled to manage. The German pilots were competent and coordinated, working together to try to pin him between them. He fought with everything he had, using every trick he had learned in months of combat, but the mathematics of the situation were against him. His Mustang took hits. He felt the impacts through the airframe, heard the distinctive sound of bullets punching through aluminum skin. His right wing showed holes, and there was a crack in his canopy where a bullet had struck but not penetrated. Still, he fought, managing to damage one of his attackers severely enough that the German pilot broke off and withdrew. Then his wingman, a young lieutenant on only his 5th mission, made a critical error. In an attempt to help Jensen, he flew across the line of fire of one of the Bf-109 seconds. The Messerschmitt's 30mm cannon shell hit the Mustang's engine, and the American fighter immediately began trailing heavy smoke. The pilot's voice came over the radio, calm despite the circumstances, announcing that he was hit and was going to bail out. Jensen broke off his engagement to cover his wingman's escape. He positioned himself between the descending pilot and the German fighters, making it clear that anyone who attempted to strafe the parachuting airman would have to go through him first. It was a violation of the unwritten rules of chivalrous combat to shoot at parachuting pilots, but such chivalry was not universal, and Jensen was taking no chances. The 2 Bf-109 seconds that had been engaging him seized the opportunity. While Jensen was focused on protecting his wingman, they positioned themselves for a coordinated attack. Jensen spotted them too late. He tried to maneuver, but his damaged aircraft responded sluggishly. Cannon shells tore through his left wing, shredding the thin aluminum skin and damaging the main spar. The Mustang rolled violently to the left, and Jensen fought the controls to level the wings. The aircraft was still flying, but barely. He could feel the damaged wing flexing in ways it was never designed to flex, and he knew that any high-G maneuver would likely cause structural failure. He was effectively helpless. The 2 Bf-109 seconds positioned themselves for the kill. Jensen could see them in his mirrors, setting up for a classic stern attack from which he had no escape. His airspeed was bleeding off, his altitude decreasing. In seconds, the German fighters would open fire and finish what they had started. What happened next was described by multiple witnesses on both sides. The rest of Jensen's flight, which had been engaged with other German fighters, saw their leader's desperate situation. The flight's second element, 2 Mustangs flown by experienced pilots, disengaged from their own combat and dove to Jensen's aid with absolute disregard for their own safety. The 2 American fighters came screaming down from above, their guns already firing. The Bf-109 seconds, focused on Jensen, didn't see them coming until too late. One Messerschmitt exploded under the concentrated fire of 12 .50 caliber machine guns. The other tried to break away but was hit in the fuel tank and immediately caught fire. The German pilot bailed out, his parachute opening just seconds before his aircraft crashed into the snow-covered ground below. Jensen's rescuers formed up on his wings, escorting him as he nursed the damaged Mustang westward. The remaining German fighters, having lost their numerical advantage and facing determined American pilots, broke off the engagement. The sky grew quiet except for the laboring sound of Jensen's damaged engine. The flight back to friendly territory was tense. Jensen's Mustang was barely controllable, requiring constant stick and rudder inputs to maintain level flight. The damaged wing made every turn a calculated risk, but the Merlin engine, despite taking multiple hits, continued to run. It ran roughly, with ominous metallic noises and periodic misfires, but it kept producing enough power to keep the aircraft in the air. Jensen made it back to Belgium and landed at the same forward airfield, where he had landed weeks earlier after running out of fuel. This time, the landing was far less graceful. The damaged wing gave less lift than the undamaged right wing, causing the aircraft to drift and skip across the grass. But Jensen kept it under control, and when the Mustang finally rolled to a stop, it was still in one piece. Ground crews who examined the aircraft were amazed it had remained airborne. The left wing had taken more than 30 hits, several of which had damaged the main spar. The airframe showed stress cracks from the violent maneuvering. The engine had been hit multiple times and had lost most of its oil. By all rights, the aircraft should have come apart in the air or crashed on landing. Jensen climbed down from the cockpit on shaking legs. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the battle was wearing off, replaced by the exhaustion that always followed intense combat. He was met by the base commander, who informed him that his wingman had been seen landing safely in his parachute behind German lines, but was likely captured. It was small comfort, but at least the young pilot was alive. The engagement resulted in 3 confirmed kills for Jensen's flight, bringing his personal total to 29. But this time, the kills were shared among the flight, with Jensen himself claiming only one of them. More significantly, he had taken damage for the first time in his combat career, a reminder that even the most skilled pilot was not invincible. Prairie fire, Jensen's beloved Mustang, was deemed non-repairable in the field and was eventually scrapped for parts. Jensen was returned to England, where he was informed that his combat tour was over. He had flown 73 combat missions, accumulated more than 400 combat hours, and achieved 29 confirmed aerial victories. By any measure, he had more than fulfilled his duty, but the war was not over, and Jensen requested to extend his tour. The request was denied. The Army Air Forces had begun to recognize that their most experienced pilots were too valuable to risk indefinitely. High-scoring aces like Jensen were needed as instructors to pass their knowledge and experience to the next generation of fighter pilots. He was ordered to return to the United States, where he would train new P-51 pilots before they deployed to the combat theaters. Jensen's departure from England in January 1945 was quiet and without ceremony, exactly as he preferred. He said goodbye to his ground crew, shook hands with the men he had flown with, and boarded a transport aircraft for the long journey home. The 357th Fighter Group would continue to fight through the final months of the war in Europe, and many of the pilots Jensen had known would not survive to see victory. The question that historians and military analysts would later debate was how Jensen had achieved what he did. 29 confirmed aerial victories was impressive enough, but the circumstances of those victories made them truly extraordinary. Most aces accumulated their scores over extended periods, in conventional engagements where they had wingmen and numerical parity or advantage. Jensen's kills came primarily in solo engagements against overwhelming odds, situations where conventional wisdom said he should have been killed. Several factors contributed to his success. First, the P-51 Mustang was arguably the finest all-around fighter aircraft of World War II. Its combination of speed, range, maneuverability, and firepower gave Jensen a superior platform from which to fight. Every advantage the Mustang provided, Jensen exploited to its fullest. Second, Jensen possessed exceptional natural ability. His spatial awareness, his ability to calculate complex trajectories and angles instantaneously, and his almost preternatural sense of timing were gifts that could not be taught. They could be refined through training and experience, but the foundation had to be innate. Third, Jensen had developed what modern military theorists would call a superior order loop: observe, orient, decide, act. He could process information, make decisions, and implement those decisions faster than his opponents. In the fluid, chaotic environment of aerial combat, speed of decision-making was often the difference between victory and death. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, Jensen had mastered the psychology of combat. He understood that aerial warfare was not just about machines and physics, but about human beings under extreme stress making life and death decisions. He could read his opponents, anticipate their reactions, and exploit their psychological vulnerabilities. When he attacked numerical superior forces, he understood that the shock and confusion of his initial assault would disrupt their cohesion, transforming an organized formation into a collection of individuals fighting separate battles. Once that happened, the numerical advantage became far less significant. After the war, Jensen returned to Nebraska and resumed his life as a civilian. He rarely spoke of his combat experiences, and few of his neighbors knew that the quiet man who ran the local crop dusting service had once been one of the most successful fighter pilots in American history. He flew for pleasure, often taking his small aircraft up in the early morning when the air was calm and clear, but he never sought the adrenaline rush of combat flying again. In the decades that followed, historians discovered details about Jensen's opponents that added further context to his achievements. Many of the German pilots he had faced were themselves experienced aces, men with multiple victories. The engagement, where he had single-handedly disrupted the formation of 30 German fighters, was later revealed to have included several Knight's Cross recipients, the Luftwaffe's highest award for valor. These were not inexperienced replacements but skilled veterans, which made Jensen's achievement even more remarkable. The technical analysis of his gun camera footage revealed that his gunnery was extraordinarily precise. His average accuracy rate, calculated from the ratio of rounds fired to hits scored, was approximately 35%, more than double the average for fighter pilots in World War II. This meant that roughly 1 in every 3 bullets he fired found its target, an astonishing achievement given the difficulty of aerial gunnery. His ammunition management was equally impressive. In several engagements, he made his limited ammunition supply last through extended combat against multiple opponents, firing only when he was certain of a hit. This discipline, combined with his marksmanship, allowed him to achieve results that would have required other pilots to expend far more ammunition. Jensen's story raises a question that has fascinated military historians. What is the limit of individual capability in combat? Throughout military history, there are accounts of individual soldiers, sailors, and airmen achieving results that seem impossible by conventional standards. Jensen's solo engagements against overwhelming odds represent one of the most extreme examples from aerial warfare. Modern fighter pilots, examining Jensen's combat reports and gun camera footage, have attempted to replicate his tactics in simulators. Even with the advantages of knowing the outcome and being able to reset the simulation after failure, few pilots have successfully managed the kind of extended solo engagements that Jensen routinely survived. This suggests that his achievements represented not just skill and courage, but something approaching the absolute limit of what a single pilot could accomplish in a single-seat fighter aircraft of that era. The legacy of Jensen's combat career extends beyond his personal score. His aggressive tactics, particularly his willingness to engage superior numbers when protecting damaged bombers, saved dozens of American aircrews who would otherwise have been shot down. The bomber crews he escorted through damaged aircraft or hostile territory made it home to fly again, to continue the strategic bombing campaign that ultimately helped bring the war to an end. His combat reports, studied by tacticians during and after the war, influenced fighter doctrine in ways that are still relevant. His emphasis on aggressive action, superior positioning, and exploitation of psychological factors became core elements of fighter pilot training. The concept of the fluid 4 formation, where elements could split and reform as tactical situations demanded, owed much to Jensen's example of how a single fighter could disrupt larger formations by attacking from unexpected angles. Jensen lived to the age of 76, passing away in 1997. In his later years, he granted a few interviews to aviation historians, providing insights into his thought processes during combat. One interview question asked him about fear. Did he feel fear when attacking overwhelming numbers of enemy aircraft? His answer was characteristically thoughtful. He explained that fear was always present, but it manifested not as panic or paralysis, but as a heightened state of awareness. The fear sharpened his senses, quickened his reactions, and focused his attention completely on the task at hand. He had learned to channel fear into fuel for performance, rather than allowing it to degrade his capabilities. When asked if he had ever considered the possibility that he might not survive a particular engagement, Jensen replied that the thought never occurred to him during combat. In the moment of battle, he was completely absorbed in the immediate problem of defeating the enemy. It was only afterward, during the quiet flight back to base, that he would sometimes reflect on how close he had come to death. The final tally of Jensen's combat career showed 29 confirmed aerial victories, 4 probable victories where destruction could not be definitively confirmed, and 15 damaged enemy aircraft. He had flown 73 combat missions, totaling over 400 combat hours. He had been shot down once and forced to ditch in the Channel. He had crash-landed damaged aircraft on 3 occasions. He had run out of fuel and glided to emergency landings twice. He had been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, the Distinguished Flying Cross with 3 oak leaf clusters, and the Air Medal with 14 oak leaf clusters. But perhaps the most telling statistic was one that didn't appear in any official record: 0. That was the number of bombers lost to enemy action while under Jensen's direct protection. Every damaged B-17 or B-24 that he escorted made it to friendly territory. Every crew he defended survived. In the calculus of war, those lives saved may have been his greatest achievement. The story of how a single P-51 pilot shot down 29 enemy aircraft, with 22 of those kills occurring in solo engagements against overwhelming odds, stands as one of the most remarkable individual achievements in the history of aerial combat. It represents the convergence of superior technology, exceptional natural ability, intensive training, and the kind of courage that drives a man to fly alone into the teeth of enemy formations rather than allow his comrades to die. Jensen's legacy endures in the continued study of aerial tactics, in the training of fighter pilots who learn from his example, and in the broader understanding of what human beings are capable of achieving when pushed to the absolute limits of skill, courage, and determination. In the end, his story is not just about shooting down enemy aircraft or accumulating victories. It is about the choices one person made in moments of extreme crisis, when the easy path was to withdraw and the harder path was to engage, to fight, to risk everything for a principle or a mission or the lives of fellow airmen. The sky above Nebraska, where Jensen learned to fly as a teenager and where he returned after the war, remains unchanged. The same winds blow across the same prairies, and the same summer thermals rise from the same fields. But the man who flew through those skies, who carried the lessons learned there to the deadly skies over Europe, who proved that one skilled and determined pilot could face overwhelming odds and prevail, left an imprint on history that time cannot erase. His story reminds us that in the crucible of combat, when everything is on the line and defeat seems certain, extraordinary individuals can achieve the impossible, one burst of gunfire at a time.